I welcome you to the dissemination event, in-depth review with interactive contents of the innovative mobility landscape, the case of mobility as a service, MaaS report. So my name is Asuka Ito, a policy analysis at the International Transport Forum and the co-author of this report, which produced in partnership with a World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So we reviewed changes in today's urban mobility landscape and the potential of mobility as a service to improve travels in cities. This dissemination event will last 1 hour, and we will first have a presentation about the overview of the project and the key findings from the report. Then we will have interactive Q&A session. So chat is disabled, but please send your question by using Q&A function freely. So now I would like to invite Philip Christ, the advisor of the innovation and foresight at the ITF, as well as the principal author of this report, to give us welcoming remarks. The floor is yours, Philip.
To this participatory workshop in which we'll go over the findings from the report that we've released just 1 month ago. The report, The Innovative Mobility Landscape, the Case of Mobility as a Service. Now, I'm especially pleased because this report was carried out, as Asuka said, in partnership with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And it underscores the ITF's role as an interactive and open platform for the discussion of transport policy issues. We do this at the ITF by working with our 63 member countries to foster a deeper understanding of the role of transport in economic growth, environmental sustainability, and social inclusion, and to use this understanding to help carry and address the serious challenges we face relating to congestion, safety, inequity, pollution, and climate change. These are all serious challenges, and addressing them requires equally serious responses. Responses that address these challenges systematically and with a long-term view. That means implementing coherent, evidence-based policies in pursuit of clear objectives. Now, addressing these challenges will require action on a number of fronts: ensuring access, improving efficiency, fostering inclusivity, spurring innovation, and contributing to a sustainable and low carbon future. And if we've learned anything in the past 1.5 years, it is the fundamental need to ensure resilience. Now, in the past, we've addressed these challenges in a siloed approach, working within each transport mode to optimize operations, services, and functions. This has led to great improvements within each mode, but to systematic challenges as well that can only be addressed by looking across different transport modes. And this is at the heart of the work we're presenting today, a shift from a focus on owning and operating single vehicles towards the seamless, effortless, and client-focused interconnection of multiple transport services, or mobility as a service, MaaS. There's a lot of hope that great efficiencies can be delivered through MaaS and that it can contribute to or even underpin sustainable mobility going forward. And so we're happy to share with you the key findings from this work and to engage with you all and other stakeholders as well, not be able to participate today, to ensure that MaaS has the best chance to contribute to a more sustainable future. And on that last word, sustainability, I'd like to turn it over to our colleague and partner in this project, Thomas Deloison from the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, for a few welcoming words from their side.
Thank you, Philippe, and thank you very much, Asuka, and welcome everyone to this dissemination event. We are pleased to, of course, have contributed to this report and have collaborated with the ITF on something that we think is going to be an important reference milestone report when it comes to understanding the intricacies and what's at stake with developing sustainable mobility. Perhaps before we dive into a little bit more, I have to introduce what the World Business Council for Sustainable Development is. And so in a nutshell, we are a CEO-led organization that is not-for-profit and that essentially harness the intentions of 200 forward-thinking business leaders in advancing the topic of sustainable development towards the achievement of a vision in which 9.5 billion of people live within the planetary boundaries by 2050. It is no small task, but we are global in nature and are acting in all sectors in order to really achieve systemic transformation across 7 systems of or economic systems, including mobility.
Sorry for interrupting, but Ande, please, next slide, please. I think this is still, yeah, thank you.
No worries. We can also already move to the following slide, where I was simply explaining where we are acting at WBCSD on these 6 economic systems, namely or including mobility, that all were in which we mobilized the private sector to accelerate the transformation towards the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and of course, our Vision 2050. In the mobility space, if we move to the next slide, we have essentially developed a framework or a strategic approach to what sustainable mobility is. And of course, it is going to be about adopting zero-emission vehicle technology in a fast decarbonization. It is also going to leverage digitalization and data sharing as a mean to improve efficiencies of mobility systems. And this is very much under this theme that we have engaged in the project with the ITF. But also, and finally, it is going to be about adopting sustainable commuting behavior practices, which also came up quite often as part of the research and the work that we have done with our colleagues from the ITF. And of course, the business partners that joined us in this journey that we had over the last 18 months. And I think on the next slide, we have an image of the business partners that joined us, namely our colleagues from Pirelli, colleagues from BNP Paribas, Toyota, and Volkswagen, along with Renault-Nissan Mitsubishi, joined us in this report, and we will hear from some of them today. But without further ado, I think Asuka will share with us a little bit more about how did we shape the project, how did we think about this intention and the related objectives.
And then next slide, please. So as Thomas mentioned, we collaborated with the above mentioned project members from private sector to analyze emerging mobility trends and to understand levers and barriers to sustainable, resilient urban mobility. And then we figure out to potential of a mobility the service to deliver sustainable and resilient urban mobility system. And also we developed relevant policy recommendations. So we conducted this project over 1.5 years. Next slide, please. Yes, so by conducting regional MaaS models and scaling challenges webinars by regions. So first of all, we conducted in Europe, and then next, North America. And then just, can you click it? Yeah. And then Asia, and then we focus on Japan. So following findings that we found, we would like to organize one more special event for Japan, planned on 15th of October. What are real challenges to achieve sustainability in transport sector in Japan? We focus on democratic targets, public and private roles and enablers of collaboration, and we will figure out how MaaS can be an opportunity to reduce carbon emission in Japanese market. Later of this webinar, we will share the registration link as well as all of these slides with participants. Thank you very much for sending me the various questions already. The slides will be available after this meeting. Okay, so now I would like to hand over again to Philip Christ to provide the key findings of this report. The floor is yours, Philip.
All right, then can I ask that we unshare the presentation and I will share the following presentation. Super. Here we go. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes is share some of the key takeaways from this report. The document itself is quite extensive, and if you download it and read it, you'll see that there's quite a bit of detail behind these key recommendations. But this is the distillation, if you will, of these 18 months of work into key top-level takeaways. And one thing that we hope is that for each takeaway, if there's an issue that you're interested in, that you go into the report, and then you can see some of the thinking that led to that key recommendation or key takeaway. So I'm going to go ahead and try to frame the work a bit. And it's quite easy actually to break down this work into three broad framing imperatives. The first is that we really have to do better to decouple mobility from the growth in emissions and resource use, in space consumption, and inequity. Mobility confers tremendous advantages, but at the same time, it has imposed significant costs, and we have to do better going forward. One of the ways in which we know how to do this is by integrating and coordinating transport services. From our estimates and our modeling that we've done in the context of the ITF Transport Outlook 2021, we estimate that by integrating and coordinating transport services, we could see about a 15% lower CO2 emission level by 2050 that would improve welfare. And mobility as a service, as part of that, can we estimate contribute up to about 5% of that overall. So a third of the type of emission reductions that we believe that can come from broad integration coordinating of transport services. But in order to do this, and this is our third key theme, public authorities and businesses will have to work together to create a vibrant MaaS ecosystem, an ecosystem that helps to improve people's daily travel experience. One of the things that came up in this report is that in the past, a lot of the focus on infrastructure in the transport sector has been on hard infrastructure. But in order to deliver that coordination, there's soft infrastructure, IT integration services that have to be deployed in order to support mobility as a service and other integration efforts within the transport sector. That is one of the key areas that we looked at. And the challenges, as I said, are significant. By looking forward, we estimate that by 2050, passenger travel will increase by grow by 133% in terms of billion passenger kilometers traveled. In urban travel, urban passenger travel will increase 163%. At the same time, urban population growth will grow by 86%, almost doubling. When we look at what that means from an emissions perspective and from a greenhouse gas emissions perspective, we estimate that 13% increase in CO2 emissions from all passenger travel would occur under business as usual, under current policies going forward. But in urban transport, we already estimate that improvements in coordination and certainly improvements in technology would by 2050 lead to 5% reduction. So we are improving in with current policies already going forward. However, in order to achieve the Paris targets that would have a good chance of stabilizing global temperatures at 1.5 degrees, increase of 1.5 degrees, we need to see an additional or a full 64% reduction from 2015 to 2050 of CO2 emissions measured tank to wheel. Now, this is a significant challenge, and technology alone will not be able to deliver on this. We need to rethink the way in which technology integrates with systems and with travel behavior and travel services. Over the past year and a half, we have seen a tremendous pause in transport trends and activity. Of course, with the lockdowns and with the decrease in commuting travel, increase in telework, this has had a significant impact. And we believe that teleworking will probably remain a feature of our mobility landscape going forward. With that, relocalization might occur around home. And that will also persist to some degree. We also see that there's been an increase in many city centers of walking, cycling, and micromobility, light mobility, that was supported by rapid infrastructure development. However, the recovery of public transport travel is lagging behind the recovery of car travel, partly for sanitary reasons and partly also because of the restructuring of the commute because of telecommuting, telework. What we believe is that the COVID-19 pandemic has been, of course, a horrible moment in time, but it also represents an inflection point where people change travel habits and we're open to experimenting with new choices. And this is something that we believe will be a point of behavior change going forward. Looking at where transport may decarbonize, we feel that urban passenger transport has the greatest potential to decarbonize. That's from our modeling, again, in support of the ITF Transport Outlook 2021. An almost 80% reduction in CO2 emissions we have modeled could be achieved under ambitious but attainable policies. And clearly, one of the key takeaways here is those pathways that lead to those lower emissions in urban areas comes from increasing load factors, so the use of vehicles, and fuel efficiency, of course. But self-driving cars, we don't have them yet commercially available except out of very small pilots in the world right now. And electric vehicles, we do have many, many of those, most of them not being cars, most of them being bicycles and e-push scooters, are yet no panacea for curbing emissions. We really do believe going forward that new forms of shared mobility, going beyond the traditional shared mobility of public transport, has great potential to reduce the need for private car use and to reduce emissions. And what we can see right now is that mobility today is quite different than mobility even 10 years ago or 20 or 30 years ago. There are more choices, there are new types of layers of mobility offers, it's much more digital, and all of these have the potential to shift future travel. There is no one size fits all. We can see the uptake of different services in North America versus Asia versus Europe versus Latin America versus Africa. But we, at the heart, must rethink the link between mobility and car use to foster that greater diversity of choice. In the past, we've for a number of reasons, tended towards reducing choices in our cities in terms of how we get around. And we're at a point now where we have seen an increase in those choices, and that's something really we need to accompany going forward. But to do that, stakeholders have to act together to ensure that these new options, in fact, contribute to greater sustainability. And here, when we try to look at the tensions between the new systems, the new services, the new modes, the new technologies, and legacy mobility services, we see that there is a very strong effect from entrenched practices, from habit, from the system inertia, from the built environment. All those are going to be elements to consider when we think about the policies that can help facilitate the shift to a more multimodal, more seamless multimodality going forward, to a real vibrant mobility as a service ecosystem. And here's the word, ecosystem. MaaS, mobility as a service, has to be seen as a distribution model for mobility, not just an app. It is an ecosystem, not just a single service. And this ecosystem promises significant benefits from integrating all these different mobility offers. MaaS focuses on the user's needs and with the right policies can contribute to better and more sustainable travel. But it is an uncertain offer right now because we don't see large-scale, commercially successful mobility as a service ecosystems yet developing in and around the world. This is a real role where both the private sector, the public sector, and the regulatory framework must all come together to foster that potential pathway towards success. And as I noted, MaaS can contribute up to that 15% CO2 emissions reduction in 2050 and improved efficiency with a specific contribution of around 5%. Ecosystem is the word that comes back again and again when we're doing this work, and not just the app, not just a single service. And this ecosystem is comprised of a number of actors. At the heart of the ecosystem is the traveler. It's you and I. It's wanting to get around in urban areas or in less urban areas, in peripheral areas, in rural areas, using the best possible, most affordable, most efficient choice available. In order to deliver that, you need services, mobility services, things that you can ride in or things that you can ride on to get you there. Where mobility as a service produces new value is the creation of these mobility as a service providers. These are the integrators that take these offers, that connect these offers, multiple offers, with the client, with the customer, with the traveler, with you or I. In order for that to work, there has to be a regulatory framework that sets the rules for those connections, that sets the rules for the data interchanges that that occur amongst these different actors. That is the broad ecosystem. Mobility as a service providers, mobility service providers, us, the traveling public, and the regulatory framework that connects it all together. And our key findings, our key messages relate to those actors and those stakeholders. One last thing before we go into the specific recommendations or specific key takeaways is that that regulatory and data governance framework should be seen not as a single entity, but we should see it as a multiple area, multiple zone, if you will, framework. On the one hand, there are going to be rules that apply to mobility operators. On the other hand, there are going to be rules that will be different in some ways and apply to those integrators that provide the MaaS services. And then there are all the rules that relate to the context, the urban mobility context in which these services are deployed. So these might be rules relating to road pricing or urban access or parking policies. What links at least the mobility operator side and the MaaS provider side is the data governance framework. And in our report, we have some specific advice on how to structure that data governance framework. But even if you just look at mobility operators and MaaS providers, if you don't act on the greater context, then you likely won't see some of the benefits that we hope that we can get from MaaS. And in particular, MaaS without that greater context, without the right rules and without the right framework, will likely not contribute the kind of sustainability outcomes or even commercial outcomes that we might hope for. It really has to come together with these three groups, these three pillars. So going to our recommendations, our key takeaways. Now, in terms of adopting mobility as a service, we strongly suggest that mobility as a service has to be anchored in a strategic vision for mobility, in an urban mobility plan, in a sustainable urban mobility plan, as we see in Europe, or in a strategic vision that encompasses the territorial area under which, in which mobility as a service will be deployed. So that can be in a rural area, it can be in a peripheral area, or in an urban area. But that strategic vision helps ensure that mobility as a service is in a broader, included in a broader vision about what people might want to expect from their mobility choices going forward. We also have to understand that mobility as a service is a secondary market, and this is a market where the key to success is providing value to the user. And there we, as I said, have not seen broad-scale commercial uptake of a effective mobility as a service ecosystem outside of small pilots. And so greater work will have to take place in order to understand, well, what is the right value offer for users that will allow mobility as a service offers to gain traction and scale up. In order to do that, we have to be mindful that providing excessive regulatory constraints at the outset might hinder some of that development. And so we have to understand where regulation is necessary and where it perhaps is something that will prevent some of the early growth of the sector. And of course, as always, there is a public authority role in guiding mobility as a service to achieve or support, or certainly not contravene, agreed societal objectives. And this may relate to the environment, it may relate to market structure, it may relate as well to equity. Now, in terms of enabling MaaS, as I said, it is early in the game, and it's probably better to adopt a flexible and light-handed regulatory approach towards mobility as a service platforms. That's because we don't know what is the successful recipe yet, and we have to give space for that recipe to emerge. But at the same time, we have to provide a predictable regulatory approach and allow for that evolution. And so we have to provide some predictability on what will be the rules, or the way in which the rules rather will evolve over time. At the core of almost every region in which we discuss mobility as a service policies, public transport will have a key role to play. And one of the things that we saw is that in many cases, public transport operators have limited ability to negotiate the terms of sale or resale of tickets within the mobility as a service ecosystem and with mobility as a service providers. We recommend revisiting that, and where it makes sense, giving that freedom to public transport operators who know best how to increase the use of their services. When we think about data sharing, there is no mobility as a service without a data sharing framework, but that data sharing framework has to be as open as possible, but of course as close as necessary to avoid some of the monopoly effects we can see from concentration of data and concentration of information. In order to deliver the mobility as a service offers, in order to allow passengers to go or travelers to go from one operator to the next, there has to be a level of data portability built into the MaaS ecosystem by default. And when we think about the ways in which data is going to be communicated from one operator to another, or from operators to public authorities when they report on their activities, there has to be some common building block. Either a single data syntax or a set of compatible, functionally compatible data syntaxes that allow this communication, this sharing, and this reporting to take place efficiently. When we look at data reporting from operators in the market to public authorities so that public authorities can understand how the market is functioning and if they need to intervene, we need to make sure that those data reporting requirements are proportionate and they're targeted to specific outcomes. There's been a tendency, especially with digital data, just because it's available to include that in the data that is required to be reported to public authorities. In many cases, much of that data is not necessary to carry out public policy outcomes. And that is a clear message going forward. We need to be much more prescriptive about the type of data, restrictive about the type of data that is being reported. And looking at supporting MaaS. As I said, MaaS will not deliver much if it's not in a context, a framework, which guides it towards developing sustainable mobility services. And so we have to think about what are the right complementary policies that will enable the mobility as a service ecosystem to develop in that way, to develop in support of higher sustainability outcomes that policymakers have a mandate to deliver. And one of those things is that we'll have to invest in the built environment in order to make the seamlessness that we can find in an app or in the mobility as a service ecosystem also be found in the built environment. Exchanges between trains and buses and taxis and ride services and scooters and bike share facilities. That real connectivity has to exist just as digital connectivity exists within the virtual environment. And finally, public authorities are being asked to regulate in an area where none of us on the private or on the public side have very much experience. And just as private players are increasing their skill sets and recruiting in new types of candidates, new types of profiles, public authorities will have to do the same in order to improve their ability to regulate and assess digital markets. So those are very quickly some of the key findings. Now, as you can see, those are fairly high level findings because these are messages that should apply globally. In the work that we are doing at the ITF, we've operationalized many of those key messages in very detailed recommendations, in this case to the Brussels Capital Region. And this report just came out recently. I'll give you the link in a second. But this is part of the ongoing work that we're doing at the ITF with WBCSD, with now the Brussels Capital Region and DG Reform at the European Commission. We're also about to release a report looking at the integration of public transport and mobility as a service, a key issue when we think about that digital architecture going forward. So I'll conclude by thanking you for listening to the overview of our report, The Innovative Mobility Landscape, the Case of Mobility as a Service. This report, as we said, carried out jointly with the WBCSD. I put the link to the report here. It'll be in the chat as well. And I direct you to the operationalization of many of those principles and very detailed recommendations that we've developed for the Brussels Capital Region, but that serve as a template for the type of regulatory framework architectures that could be adopted in many different contexts, not just in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip, for your excellent presentation, concrete and very precise. And we now move on to the Q&A session with audience. So we are receiving a lot of questions right now. So I want to address one by one. And also we would like to invite two distinguished speakers from project member. First one will be Mr. Stefano Porro, Head of Future Mobility of Pirelli. So Stefano, what are your views on mobility as a service? So what was the meaning of this project for your company?
Thank you very much, Asuka. Nice to meet you, and thanks for inviting me to this event. Of course, for us, it was very, very interesting this project because we really think that inside the path towards sustainable mobility, MaaS has really an important role. It's one of the most important, and we also think that for company, this is a big opportunity, and company can really help policymaker in make MaaS accepted and do this cultural change that is needed for having always a more sustainable mobility. So for us, this project was very interesting. There was both a big deep dive in all the solution possible, and also at the end, the next step that are necessary for going in that direction. So absolutely very interesting, this project.
Stefano, thank you so much for helping us this project all over the time. And now we would like to invite Mr. Ronan Pierre, Head of Mobility for Corporates, Alval, BNP Paribas Groups. So Ronan, what is the role of business in the mobility sector to shape sustainable mobility solutions? We have a lot of related questions from the audience now.
Okay, hi everyone, and nice to meet you. Thanks for inviting me. Well, I think the businesses are in the middle of this ecosystem because they have, I think, two roles to play. The first one is by creating new value propositions. Of course, this is about innovation, and innovation cannot be done in this case alone. So there's a great stake of collaboration, and I would even say co-opetition, meaning collaboration between competitors. No one can do this all by himself. So it's really about, as Philippe said, building ecosystem, sharing data, bringing together the pieces of the puzzle to make the best out of it and bring new value proposition to the end users. And this is a very fundamental role of the business here to stay out of the comfort zone and try to work together to do that. But in the meantime, there's also a stake for businesses to be not only pushing for this new technology, but also adopting it for their own purpose, for their own employee, and to nudge their employee into using more sustainable way to move around and to have a global impact on the society by diversifying their mobility policies.
Thank you so much. So Thomas, can you point to the key action the private sector needs to take to help shape a favorable environment for MaaS?
I think we've heard some of these elements already, but I want to make it perhaps clearer here. It is essential for the stakeholders across the mobility, what we used to call the value chain, which in this case is an ecosystem, to really embrace digital services and to proceed in the digital mobility services development and the deployment of a MaaS as an ecosystem with an open mindset and approaches to data sharing, in example, in an as open as possible way, but of course, protecting some of the commercially sensitive, competition-oriented, and of course, privacy-related questions very, very hardly. I think it's important to focus on the value, and by value, it means to align to the outcomes that are required in a specific region or a specific city, because without having the MaaS ecosystem aligned to the policy outcomes for sustainability, it is very probable that we will miss a part of the value that the MaaS can create, which is not just economical, but also highly environmental and social. I think it's from that perspective that there needs to be as much as possible collaboration, of course. And I just also want to point out an opportunity, perhaps, is once we have established the ability to share data and enable MaaS, there's a lot to be done in innovating across the private stakeholders and the private sector, but also in collaboration with the public sector, leveraging what MaaS is and how MaaS allows for data sharing for further opportunities to create value. Again, not just economical value, but also environmental and social value.
Right, so we are talking about exactly the system with a lot of creation and a lot of potential, because MaaS challenges various existing models for the organization and deliver of mobility within and outside of urban areas. So now, we have heard the perspective, several perspectives from the global private sector, but a lot of the mobility relies on the provision of public services. So Philip, what do the torrents mentioned by Stefano, Rona, and Thomas mean for the public sector? And what does sustainable mobility look like for public authorities?
Well, I mean, the challenges are at the core of what the public sector has to deliver. Public authorities have a mandate to deliver a number of things. They have to deliver an efficient transport system. They have to deliver a system that is safe. They have to deliver a system that doesn't pollute and contributes to sustainability outcomes and livability outcomes. This is at the core of the public service mission, if you will, when it relates to transport generally. And the same can be said for mobility as a service. So what I would say to that question, Asuka, is that the public authorities must create the super ecosystem in which the MaaS ecosystem can best function to deliver on those things. Mobility as a service, as I said, is a market. It's a secondary market. It's a market built on integration. And so there clearly has to be room for commercial outcomes in that market. Outcomes, and by commercial outcomes, I mean outcomes where actors can find value and then reinvest that value into whatever they need to reinvest it. So that means public transport is also part of that commercial outcome. They also need to find a way in which they can derive value from mobility service and reinvest that into their missions. So in order to do that, I think it's really clear that that super ecosystem be set. There's a question in the Q&A coming in from Stein. Shout out to Antwerp. And Stein asked, well, what about the flanking measures? I would say the public authority's role is, I wouldn't call them flanking measures. They are the main measures. Setting the price, setting the rules, setting the parking policy. And once that's done, the important thing is to give freedom for the mobility as a service providers to develop an offer that finds the market, that finds people who want to use it in a way that, because the ecosystem has been set, is more sustainable. So I can't emphasize that too much. The real role for public authorities is to create the garden, if you will, the force in which the MaaS ecosystem will function. The MaaS ecosystem without that is not necessarily going to be a sustainable one, and it may not even be a profitable one.
Now we would like to invite one more speaker from ITF, expert on rural transport policies. Lucy, please answer this question. So we focus on the urban mobility landscape in this report, but how about the rural mobility landscapes?
So hi everyone, Lucy Kirstein. I'm working as a policy analyst at the ITF, and this autumn, we're going to release a new report on rural mobility innovations, and we see that in rural areas, the challenges that we face are quite different. So in the economic domain, we have the issue of low density of demand. We have environmental issues, including car dependency and longer distance, high carbon trips. On the social side, many rural areas face aging populations or out-migration of active populations. We have increasing rural-urban inequalities, including also the digital divide, and a great diversity of needs that are currently not being met in the same level as in urban areas because also of missing strategic rural policy. What we found is that, of course, there's a lot that is being tried and tested in terms of innovative mobility, and we conceptualize this in three different blocks. So there are the shared rides, there are also the shared assets, there's also multimodal integration to a certain extent, but we have seen that these approaches are rarely implemented on a wider scale, and they also lack integration with the transport network. And one reason for this is the current policy funding and legal institutional environment for these services. There are a lot of isolated pilots that are not really part of a wider effort to rethink rural mobility networks. They currently involve very few users. Their funding periods are very short, which means that it's still quite hard to observe effects in terms of behavior change. And if we're talking about a MaaS, or what could be rural MaaS, what does it mean in rural areas? I think that the concept is quite different. There are diverse challenges that need to be addressed, and it needs to be it needs to be an approach that actually takes into account the difficulty also funding transport in these areas. So there are some approaches that come in that are really targeted at improving the financial frameworks for integrating or streamlining different mobility services. You know that in rural areas we don't have the same choice of services, we don't have the same number of actors, but instead there are authorities who have tried to horizontally streamline different subsidized mobility services, such as non-emergency medical transportation and paratransit, and also trying to combine passenger and freight transport, as we have seen, for example, in Finland and Denmark. And there are also approaches that, for example, in the US, where rural MaaS and the possibility to include different services on a digital platform increases the supply of transport options that involves users more as prosumers, so that those who contribute to the pool of drivers and also the number of available vehicles, and also acknowledges that the car will somehow remain a part of the rural mobility landscape. But in fact, some of the MaaS type solutions that we see emerging there, although at a very little scale at the moment, they help use these car assets in a much more efficient way.
Okay, thank you so much. So you mentioned the Finnish MaaS project, and then there are some of the questions related to Finnish MaaS project. So can you just highlight why their project is well developed? If you have any idea, Lucy?
So could you point me to the exact question?
It seems as if the Finnish MaaS project is well developed, more than other plans else, from Ms. Ann. So do you have info on their success for the moment and what is their way forward?
Philippe,
yeah, Philippe is raising hand.
Yeah, I can answer that, or I can hopefully address that. So there isn't a Finnish MaaS project per se. There have been a number of startups that have emerged from Finland delivering mobility as a service. And that's partly because the Finnish Ministry of Transport has really tried to favor that. What has happened in Finland was the implementation of a nationwide regulatory framework that facilitates the sharing of information among multiple transport operators. So this is going back to what we were saying earlier. It's part of that building block, if you will, that enables the emergence of a MaaS market. And again, at least some of the largest commercial operators that are offering MaaS services have emerged from Finland, including MaaS Global, that's both present in Helsinki and a few other areas outside of Finland. What I can say is that the concept of MaaS is well developed in Finland. The successful commercial deployment of MaaS is also challenged in Finland, as it is elsewhere. And I think part of the reason it's challenged is because that regulatory framework isn't fully in place yet. So very importantly, what Finland did, what the Act on Transport Services did in Finland, was to say that all mobility operators had to share data, and they identified specific types of data they had to share. They didn't go so far as to say how they needed to share it, in what format they needed to share it, and with what frequency or latency they needed to share it. But that was a first big step forward. I would say that after that, we've seen other national frameworks emerge, like the Loi d'orientation des mobilités in France, which goes a bit further in saying who needs to share what data to whom, under what terms, and with what latency. And I think, again, that's another brick, if you will, another brick in the foundation for mobility as a service. And without wanting to toot our own horn, the recommendations that we made for the Brussels Capital Region goes even one step further. And we specify how in that region, but elsewhere as well, you can actually conceive of that data regulatory framework with the concept of sharing and how that sharing takes place via distributed APIs, with the concept of portability, which goes beyond the portability requirements that are in the EU's data privacy law, the GDPR, that supports the creation of the market, of course, with consumer consent. And finally, the kind of data reporting recommendations that a functioning dynamic MaaS ecosystem should incorporate. So I think we're getting closer and closer to what that regulatory framework looks like. I have to say that from a public policy perspective, that's the most important task. Once you've built the foundation, ideally, both private and public actors can build their MaaS offers on that common, if you will, data resource, on that common foundation. And that's really what we need to move towards. And that's one of the highlights of the messaging that we have with the WBCSD report and the highlights of the messaging that we're doing elsewhere. That common resource has to be built, just like more than 100 years ago, we built roads before we could have functioning urban mobility systems that are based on then the innovation, which was the car. Now we're talking about how to build this innovation ecosystem for MaaS, and that requires building that common data resource, and we're still not there yet.
Yeah, thank you so much. So you mentioned about Brussels Capital Region. So in Europe, despite taking an early lead in developing the concept of MaaS and deploying early trials, Europe has yet to see the large-scale adaptation of commercially successful MaaS. But how about North America and other Asian countries that we found? So do you want to add a little bit, Philip?
Well, I think one of the key things that came out of our stakeholder engagement that we undertook with WBCSD. So in North America, or rather in the Americas, because we also had South American participants, in Asia, in Japan, and in Europe, was that there were some fundamental differences. And one of the key differences, at least in North America, and to a certain extent in Asia, was the role that public transport could play. In North America, outside of the large urban areas, public transport is not a core element of delivering mobility in those urban regions. And so the message that we had around public transport being at the core of public transport that was built, of course, on the European and Asian context simply doesn't resonate as well. Doesn't mean it doesn't resonate at all, but it just means that there's probably likely going to be more room initially for mass transit operators. I think Ariel says it quite well in the chat. Quasi-public transport services that are provided by private players that are regulated for public policy outcomes. And so I think that's something that we might see in North America, is more this private participation in the market. In Asia, we see that in many large areas, there is well-functioning, considering the size of these urban metros, public transport, especially in developed Asia. But outside of those areas, we see a huge role for informal public transport or informal mobility. And a real question going forward is, can we do better in integrating that massive service that's delivered by these jitneys, by these on-demand services that are sometimes analog and now increasingly more digital, into a mobility as a service ecosystem? It's a very different challenge than what we're talking about in Europe in terms of having a core pure player public transport operator and all these emerging services. And finally, in Japan, but not just in Japan, in Hong Kong as well, we see that the public transport operator is in fact a private transport operator. So as a mass transit operator, going back again to Ariel's point in the Q&A. And so there, what are the incentives for such a strong private player in the market to actually open their systems and integrate with these other operators in order to provide this more seamless mobility. Those are a unique set of challenges. And it's also a unique governance challenge because we don't have the same levers, if you will, in order to create that MaaS ecosystem. So those are some of the differences that we see going across the board, in addition to the differences that Lucy rightly pointed out that exist between rural areas, peripheral areas, and city centers.
Thank you so much. So now some public transport provider and operator also generate revenue from digital services on their apps. So from non-transport actor point of view, Ronan, to close up, so as bank, do you want to appeal your bank's new initiative on that?
Well, as we said, the MaaS really turned around this ecosystem principle. So it's not just about financing the actors that are directly linked to developing MaaS. It's also about giving the means to innovate to maybe actors that are a little bit further down the chain or further from the ecosystem. And we try at BNP Paribas to have this ecosystem approach, ecosystemic approach, and to diversify the investments and to give the means to all the actors to be able to innovate and work together to produce this MaaS and make it happen. So I would say that's what we are trying to do at a high level, and we turn this into reality by also providing MaaS ourselves at Arval. But these are two different levels of operation. Yeah.
Indeed. So we have to collaborate public and the private sector even more to scale up MaaS. So Thomas, can you just wrap a summary of this
I will try.
session? Yes.
I will try to wrap, but there's such a wealth of knowledge and exchange. Again, we would like to encourage everyone to consult the report, reach out to us, social networks or others to know more. But my key takeouts for today really is first to really understand that MaaS is an ecosystem and MaaS serves an outcome. MaaS serves an intention to improve in some way mobility, whether it is access or sustainability or others. Secondly, that MaaS cannot be functional without a solid, defined set of building blocks that attract to digital mobility and data sharing. And I think the examples provided by Philippe based on the case in France, case in Belgium, but also the findings or the results of the study that was done for Brussels region was making a lot of sense to be mentioned. With that, I also would like to encourage everyone along the lines of what Ronan has said, that this is going to be an ecosystem shift. So it's not just the mobility operators and the stakeholders that are going to have to adapt and find their ways to create value or adapt their models so that they continue to thrive within the transport ecosystem. But it is really something that needs to be embraced by stakeholders, including those users, the private sector. And we've talked about the enterprises and the companies. And so adopting the MaaS as an ecosystem or as a way to change behaviors holds a lot of value in our opinion, and we should definitely look into that, along with the very important need to measure. This is still an embryonic concept that is proving to be working here and there in some instances, but not others. And so it is essential that we establish MaaS, enable MaaS, but also measure and evaluate the impact and the outcomes of MaaS. And that essentially calls for my last point, which is let's be flexible as much as possible. There needs to be governance model for the data sharing, governance model for the outcomes of MaaS as an ecosystem of ecosystems that essentially are going to evolve over time. We are only at the beginning of what MaaS can deliver. It holds a lot of promise, but it requires everyone clear focus on what could be the North Star of MaaS and the related flexibility to adapt according to measurements on the regulations and the practices that are making MaaS such a hopeful promise. That would be my key points.
Very good. Thank you so much. So Lucy and Stefano, if you have last words, we have a few minutes to end. So if you have any last words.
Yeah, so maybe some things that were pointed out also by participants through the Q&A is that there needs to be an mobility offer underlying MaaS, and especially from a rural perspective, if the services that are supposed to be integrated are not there, it doesn't make any sense to work on the integration. So that's maybe some key takeaway especially for areas where the mobility offer is not as good, that we need a strategic system of a strategic mobility policy that considers all areas.
Indeed. And Stefano, do you have any last words?
From my point of view, it's very important really to say that that municipality for a urban region really should work together always more with companies, because they can find really good allies, and they can really work together because it's easier inside a company to bring really the culture and to try new modes of moving, and really bring the new culture about new services, and switch from present situation to a really service-based one. And the intention and the final goals is very similar, and we have a big opportunity on this. So dialogue between companies and also municipalities, or generally speaking with the government, it's really, really important in this side. One can do little without the other.
Okay, thank you very much. Andy, can you just show the Japan event for advertisement in 1 minute? So Japan presents unique case where national government policy has sought to explore and adapt different MaaS models to specific targeted outcomes. But based on what we discussed today, we can focus on one specific country's market to talk about 4 hours. How MaaS can improve societal goals. So if you want to continue this discussion, please register to this next webinar. So thank you so much for joining us today, and all excellent panelists that we had. And particular, thank you so much for Ande to host this webinar as background. Thank you very much.